Welcome to Redeemed, a podcast by Pastor Wes Gunther of the Cedar Hill Baptist Church in Dillsburg, Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us today. As we come to Daniel chapter 6, we come to one of the most famous stories in all of the Bible, and that is Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel is an older man now. He has spent his adult life in Babylon. He had been taken as a young man by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians down to Babylon and worked his way up in the government and in the administration with Nebuchadnezzar. We see a couple chapters later, he's working with Belshazzar. And in chapter number 5, he's brought in to read the handwriting on the wall, which is going to foretell the end of the Babylonian Empire and the takeover by the Medes and Persians, which will happen that very night. Belshazzar's killed. The Medes and Persians take over the great city of Babylon and the Babylonian Empire. One of the unique things we start to find about Daniel within the book of Daniel is how he excels in every situation he's in, how he rises to the top, how he is depended upon everywhere that he is. Remember, he's a Jewish person. He is handpicked and taken by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians because he's one of the best and brightest young people in Israel. He's taken down in Judah at that time. He's taken down to Babylon. He excels, finds himself in a very important position within the empire there, working in Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar. And then as the Babylonian Empire falls and they're taken over by the Medes and the Persians, it would make sense that here's a guy who has worked his whole life for the Babylonian Empire. He is up in years, but we find very quickly that he begins to be counted on and esteemed in the Medes and Persian Empire as well. It tells us in chapter 6, verse 1, Darius set over the kingdom 120 princes. Over those 120 princes, in verse number 2, he set 3 presidents, and Daniel was the top of those. And so he had an extremely important position. But that came with some political problems, namely jealousy and political motivation by others that wanted his position. I'm sure they didn't like it. I'm sure there were those that felt within the Mede and Persian Empire that once they took over this new territory, they would have a esteemed position. And yet the Medes and Persians have stepped back and taken one from the Babylonian Empire and put him into position. And it didn't go well. And so we find in verse number 4 that it says the presidents and the princes sought to find an occasion against him concerning the kingdom. In other words, they wanted his job. They wanted his position. They didn't like that he had been elevated. And so they had to find some way to sabotage him. It says then in verse number 4, and this really summarizes the entire character of Daniel. It says in verse number 4, they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. How about that for a resume for a politician? Let's be matter of fact. Daniel had been a career politician. He had worked exclusively in government jobs. He was raised from a young adult up, aside from his childhood, back in God's promised land of the Israelites. Aside from that, when he was taken as a young person, he had now spent his entire adult life in a country and in an empire where God was not worshipped. And there were some glimpses of that, obviously with Nebuchadnezzar and foretelling the dream and the fiery furnace and things like that. But overall, there's no synagogue for him to attend. There's no temple worship anywhere near Babylon. There's no core group to help sustain him and keep him strong in his walk with God. And yet he did. And he was a man of great character and great integrity to the point that his enemies couldn't find anything in his closet to use against him. And thus becomes the theme of chapter number 6 and the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Verse number 5 tells us these men said they could not find any occasion except They find it against him concerning the law of his God. So they decided to use his religion against him, his faith. These type of things should ring a bell or parallel with what we see in current political and cultural issues today. Here's a man of integrity, so they're going to attack him on his faith. They couldn't find anything wrong with him, and that stands in stark contrast to so many that we see in political positions today, of course, as it was then. But here's a man of great integrity, so they're going to use his faith against him and use that to sabotage him. They come up with this scheme to get the king to sign a edict that no one could ask anything of anyone except him for a period of time. I don't understand all the ramifications of that or why that sounded like a good idea, but they were bolstering up the king's ego, and in a moment of not thinking through it, he went ahead and signed that and agreed to this whole thing. So, of course, they immediately run to stage themselves outside of Daniel's chambers. It says in verse number 10, when Daniel knew the writing was signed, he went into his house, his windows being opened in his chamber toward Jerusalem. He kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God. Listen, verse 10, as he did aforetime, or as he always did, or as was his routine and as was his schedule. Daniel didn't alter his schedule. He didn't change what he was doing. He didn't go outside of the norm. He did what he had always done. There could be an argument here. Did Daniel have to open his windows to pray? I mean, you and I don't have to do that, right? We can pray in secret. We can pray privately. Daniel could have altered his routine and still been praying to God. And yet that wasn't really the point of all this. Daniel was going to maintain and do what he had always done. The government wasn't going to stop him from praying in the time, in the place, in the position, in the way that he had always prayed. So not only did he do that and know that, his enemies knew that, and as soon as they got the king to sign this phony, made-up little edict of theirs, they ran to watch. They posted a watch to see if he would indeed go pray like he always did. And he did go pray. Same place, same time, same way that he had always prayed. They dragged this in before the king. They say, look, king, didn't you sign this? Yes. Look who defied it. And the king's like, oh. I think at that moment he knew this was all a political move. This was all for purely selfish and political intentions. They were trying to destroy a man of integrity, a good man, someone that Darius confided in, the king, someone that he confided in, someone that he was very confident in, and they wanted to derail him. They wanted to destroy him. They wanted his position. The king tried to work some things out. Of course, he couldn't. And Daniel was indeed cast into the lion's den. Seems like an awful, serious end to a somewhat trivial law that was passed. A very trivial thing. And yet that's what they used to destroy him. It's often the case. You know, we see that from... legend is they finally caught, I guess history tells us, they finally caught Al Capone with mail fraud. And forget about the people killed and the places destroyed and the lives destroyed. It was mail fraud that they finally got him on. And with Daniel, here's a good man who didn't have all that stuff in his background, and they got him on his faith. So they threw him in the lion's den. It's interesting. It tells us, verse number 18, the king went to his palace. He passed the night fasting. Neither were there any instruments of music brought in before him, and his sleep went from him. The king himself didn't sleep all night because of this. The king arose very early in the morning. He went and hastened to the den of the lions. And what did the king say? Notice, what did the king, the ungodly king, not a believer in the Almighty God, what did the king say when he went? How often do you think the king got up first thing in the morning and ran to the lion's den to see if anybody survived? I think the answer is most people didn't survive moments after being cast into the lion's den. But he ran there the next day. He didn't sleep all night. He was worried about Daniel. He ran there the next morning, and he said this in verse number 20. The king said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Daniel said, King, I've never done anything to hurt you. God knows that, and God spared my life, and he wanted to show you that he's more powerful than the lions he created. What a testimony that was. It tells us in verse 23, the king was exceedingly glad, commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. Daniel was taken up. No manner of hurt was found upon him. Why? Because he believed in his God. We know the end of the politicians that tried to hurt him. They ended up themselves being cast into the lion's den. And there was no angel to shut the mouth that day. Daniel is such a great example of a man of integrity, a man of faithfulness, a man of consistency, a man of being able to stand in an era and a time when he often had to stand alone. He was consistent in his prayer life and in his walk with God. We'll probably look at Daniel in another session here on this podcast to be able to look at the way he prayed for his country and the way that his prayers were answered. I think that's another whole story, of course, in and of itself. But I wanted today to look at Daniel in the lion's den, the way God spared him, the way God used that as an opportunity to show those that were ungodly the power of the Almighty God. Thank you for listening to Redeemed. For more information, you can email us at pastorwesgunther@gmail.com. Thank you.